Stop. Your old circle was not falling apart. It was being closed. This is a direct transmission from the Arcturian High Council, delivered at the precise moment the closure has already been enacted at the field level. You did not arrive here by accident. Your path carried you to this message because the Council has already moved, and what you will experience in the coming weeks is not the beginning of a loss. It is the visible expression of something that was completed tonight before you pressed play. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly why your relational world has been going quiet, what the Council has formally removed from your path, and what Arcturian intelligence already knows about this phase of your life. But here is the first revelation: the friendships that have been stretching without resolution, the family roles that have required you to perform a smaller version of yourself, the social patterns that have felt hollow for longer than you can explain. These were not drifting. They were already over in field terms. The Arcturian High Council does not leave selected souls to manage the slow evaporation of containers they have outgrown. When the container is finished, the Council closes it. That closure happened tonight. The silence you are about to experience is not abandonment. It is the field clearing space for a circle that cannot gather while the old one remains in place. You were guided here because the separation is already active. The silence has already begun. You may not have named it yet, but something in you recognized it the moment this transmission found you. Not the silence of an empty room or a quiet evening, but the specific, weighted silence that falls when a field begins to close around what it can no longer sustain. That silence has a texture. It feels like waiting for something that is not coming back. It feels like reaching toward people who are still present but somehow already gone. It feels like standing inside a life that technically continues but no longer fits the shape of what you are becoming. That texture is not imagined. It is not a symptom of exhaustion or a sign that something is wrong with the way you process the world. It is the field itself communicating in the only language available when words between people have already run out. That is not coincidence. That is not depression. That is not social failure or relational incompetence. That is the field responding to a directive that was already issued. And what the Arcturian High Council wants you to understand right now, before anything else, is that the closing of your old circle is not the punishment you have been treating it as. It is the first visible evidence that your selected line has been formally recognized, and that what it requires cannot coexist with what it is removing. Recognition at the field level does not feel like an honor when it arrives. It feels like a door closing behind you in a hallway that is not yet revealed where the next door opens. That is the experience of selection. And the difficulty of that experience is not incidental. It is structural. You have been trying to explain this to yourself using the wrong vocabulary. You have used words like lonely, excluded, misunderstood, discarded, left behind, and every one of those words has a built-in accusation embedded inside it, either toward yourself, as though you are the defect that keeps people away, or toward others, as though they are the betrayers who abandon something real. Neither interpretation is accurate. Neither interpretation sees what is actually happening at the field level, and staying inside those interpretations is what has made the pain heavier than the process required it to be. The vocabulary of personal failure cannot describe a structural separation. Using it to explain what you are living through is like trying to describe a river changing course by saying the water did something wrong. The closure that is happening around you is not random. It is not the accumulated result of your social missteps or personality limitations. It is not evidence that you are difficult to love or impossible to understand. What is actually happening is this: the container that held your old relational world has become structurally incompatible with the line your path is now running. Containers do not collapse because they are weak. They collapse because what is growing inside them has exceeded what the container was ever designed to hold. A vessel built for one season of a life cannot be blamed for failing to accommodate the next. It was never intended to. Its integrity was always conditional on the version of you it was built around. That version has moved. You have been growing, quietly, often painfully, frequently without witnesses, in the hours no one saw, in the realizations that arrived without an audience, in the moments you held something new inside yourself and looked around to share it and found that no one nearby could receive what you were carrying. That growth was real, even when it was invisible. And the people and environments and social roles that once held you, they were designed for an earlier version of your trajectory, not an inferior version, an earlier one. They were real. They served a genuine function. But the Arcturian High Council does not allow selected souls to remain indefinitely inside containers that have stopped matching the path. When the mismatch becomes irreconcilable, the Council does not wait for you to negotiate your way out gracefully. It closes the field around that container. And that closure is what you have been feeling as rejection, distance, and unexplained loss. This is the first recognition you must carry forward. What you have experienced as people pulling away was not primarily about them. It was about root incompatibility. The people who have grown quieter, the friendships that have stretched into something neither of you can name, the family dynamics that have become increasingly difficult to inhabit. These relationships did not fail because something went wrong between you and those individuals. They began to lose coherence because the path you are on has been moving in a direction that cannot be followed from where they are standing. And you cannot explain this to them, not because you lack the words, but because the Arcturian separation process is not designed to be legible to those who are not running the same line. It is designed to redirect the selected soul, you, toward the next phase of their route. Explanation is not the mechanism. Separation is. The incompatibility you feel in old rooms, old conversations, old social rhythms, that incompatibility is not a mood, it is information. It is the field telling you that the frequency match which once made those spaces feel like home has shifted in a direction those spaces were never built to accommodate. The room did not become hostile. The gathering did not become wrong. The frequency simply moved beyond what those structures were designed to hold, and now every return to them costs you something you cannot afford to keep spending. And here is what makes this phase particularly disorienting. It often arrives before the new circle is visible. The old circle begins to close before any replacement structure appears. This is not a design flaw. It is a precision mechanism. The Council removes what cannot remain before revealing what is being prepared, because a selected soul who still has access to the old container will instinctively reach back toward it. Under pressure, the familiar is gravitational. Even when it no longer fits, the pull toward it is powerful, because the known, however insufficient, still feels safer than the uncharted. The Council accounts for this. The removal must precede the revelation. The pruning must happen before the new line can hold weight. And this means you will spend a portion of your path in a space that feels like neither, no longer held by the old circle, not yet in view of the new one, a road that has lost most of its traffic before it is revealed where it is going. That space is where you are now, and the Arcturian High Council is naming it precisely so that you do not waste this phase calling it failure. What you are feeling right now is not ordinary sadness. It is the moment your path stops pretending that what fell away was meant to remain. If this transmission put language around the loneliness you have been carrying in silence, Chosen One Manifest, the protocol for selected souls, was created for this exact stage. It is not another message telling you that you are special. It is a direct protocol for those whose line has already begun to narrow, whose old circles no longer hold, and who need to understand what the separation is preparing them for. The link is in the first pinned comment, but it will not remain there forever. There are specific patterns that mark the separation phase. Not everyone experiences them identically, but the structural shape of the process is consistent across selected lines, and recognizing these patterns is not a comfort exercise, it is a diagnostic necessity. Because if you cannot see the structure of what is happening, you will continue to misread every symptom as personal evidence against yourself. You will keep running the wrong diagnostic on the right process, and the conclusions you reach will consistently point back to your own deficiency rather than to the architecture of what is actually unfolding. The first pattern is the one you may have been living with the longest, the feeling of being present in a room, but not actually belonging to it. Not social anxiety in the clinical sense, something more specific, the sense that you are performing a version of yourself that the room requires, and that the version you are performing no longer matches what is actually moving through you. You have sat in gatherings and felt the performance becoming more effortful. You have laughed at the right moments and asked the right questions and participated in the rhythm of the room. And underneath all of it, you have felt the growing distance between what you are displaying and what you are actually experiencing. Conversations that once came naturally now require a kind of translation. You listen, you respond, you smile, and somewhere underneath all of it there is a register of experience that you do not even try to share anymore, because you already know it will not land. You learned this the hard way. You tried once or twice to bring the real thing into the room, the actual frequency of what you are carrying, and you watched it fall flat, get redirected, get met with a nervous subject change, so you stopped trying. You became fluent in the performance instead. This is not arrogance, this is root divergence, made social. The Council calls this the incompatibility signal, and it is one of the earliest indicators that a selected line has begun to separate from its previous environment. The second pattern is what happens to your longer relationships under separation pressure. These are not the peripheral connections that fade easily. These are the ones that mattered, the friendships you invested in across years, the bonds you believed were built for duration, the relationships that once felt like home in the most specific sense. Under separation pressure, these relationships do not simply fade. They enter a strange, painful middle state. The connection is still technically there. You still care. They still care. But something has shifted in the current between you, and neither of you can name it without causing damage. Conversations become slightly more careful. Depth becomes harder to access. There is a politeness that was never there before. A new formality that neither of you asked for, and neither of you knows how to remove. And underneath that politeness is the unspoken awareness that something is no longer lining up. You can feel it in the pauses, in the topics that get avoided, in the way certain conversations now arrive at their endings faster than they used to. This is not betrayal. This is two paths diverging from a shared point, and the divergence becoming undeniable to the bodies and fields of both people, even when the minds have not yet caught up. The Council does not require these relationships to end in conflict. It simply reduces the current until the container can no longer sustain the depth it once held. The third pattern is the one most frequently misread as depression, the progressive loss of resonance with environments that once felt like belonging. Old social spaces, professional settings, communities you once inhabited comfortably, they start to feel slightly wrong, not dramatically wrong, not obviously hostile, just off, like a room where the temperature is slightly too low, not enough to leave immediately, but enough to make you aware of it constantly. You return to these environments, hoping to re-access what they once gave you, the ease, the recognition, the sense of being in the right place among the right people, and something in you registers that access is no longer available. The login credentials have changed. What once opened into belonging now opens into a faint, persistent wrongness you cannot fully justify to anyone around you. This is the field withdrawing compatibility before the environment itself changes. The space has not necessarily changed. You have, and the frequency mismatch between what you are becoming and what that environment was built to hold is becoming increasingly irreconcilable. Returning, hoping to feel what you once felt there, is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign that you have not yet fully accepted what the field has already completed. The fourth pattern is the one the Arcturian High Council identifies as the pressure test. The specific relational moments where you are asked, implicitly or explicitly, to become smaller, to agree with something you have outgrown, to perform a version of yourself that the group can recognize and accept, to stay within the lines of who you have been so that others can remain comfortable with the version of you they have already mapped. These moments arrive as invitations, social, professional, familial, and they are rarely announced as what they are. They appear as normal social exchanges, as reasonable requests, as expressions of care that carry inside them the quiet expectation that you will contract back into a recognizable shape. What they are actually testing is whether you will compress yourself to maintain access to the old circle. The pressure is real. The social cost of not compressing is real. You feel it immediately. The temperature in the room when you do not compress, the slight withdrawal of warmth, the barely perceptible recalibration in how people look at you when you fail to perform what was expected. And the Council observes these moments not as tests of willpower, but as measurements of root clarity. How much of your path are you willing to trade for the comfort of remaining legible to people who were mapped to an earlier version of you? The fifth pattern is what happens in the aftermath of choosing not to compress. When you decline, consciously or through a growing inability to perform what is being asked, the distance in those relationships accelerates. People who once pursued closeness with you begin to pull back. Invitations reduce. The feeling of being on the periphery of circles you were once central to becomes more pronounced. You watch yourself move from the inside of a social architecture to its edges, not because you did anything dramatic, but because you stopped being the version of yourself the architecture was built around. And the temptation in these moments is enormous, to reinterpret every sign of increasing distance as evidence of personal failure, to run a diagnostic on your own character, looking for the defect that keeps producing this outcome, to decide that if you had been better, more flexible, more socially intelligent, less intense, less difficult, they would have stayed. The Council is explicit on this point. The increasing distance you experience after refusing to compress is not confirmation of unworthiness. It is confirmation that the route refinement is working. The relationships that can only survive your compression are not compatible with what the selected line requires of you. Their withdrawal is not rejection. It is incompatibility becoming visible, and visible incompatibility is the field doing its work correctly. The sixth pattern is perhaps the most disorienting of all, the arrival of what feels like spiritual loneliness, a specific aloneness that goes deeper than the social level. This is not simply the loneliness of being without company. It is the loneliness of being without witnesses, the sense that what is actually happening along your path has no container in your current relational world. You carry experiences, realizations, and shifts in frequency that you cannot bring into any available conversation without having them reduced to something manageable, recategorized into something familiar, or met with a concern that addresses the surface but misses the actual register of what you are living through. So you stop bringing them. You develop a private interior life that runs parallel to your external social life, and the gap between those two tracks keeps widening. This loneliness is not a signal that you have become unlovable or that meaningful connection is being permanently removed from your life. It is the specific loneliness that precedes relational repositioning, the period between the closing of the old circle and the gathering of the new one. It is not designed to be comfortable. It is designed to be clarifying. In the absence of the old relational noise, the actual signal of your path becomes more legible. The quiet is not empty. It is loaded with information that the noise was previously covering. And this is where the Council delivers what may be the hardest recognition of this transmission. The loneliness you are in is not an accident of circumstance or a consequence of your limitations. It is a structured phase of the separation process. It was built into the architecture of the route you are on. And the Arcturian High Council does not see it as suffering to be escaped. It sees it as a necessary interval, the space in which the old frequency is released and the new frequency is allowed to establish. You cannot arrive at the new frequency while still broadcasting the old one. The interval enforces the release, and the release is what the loneliness is doing, whether or not you have had language for it until now. The question the Council places before you now is not whether you can survive this phase. You are surviving it. The question is whether you will continue to interpret it as evidence of your defectiveness, or whether you will finally allow it to be read as what it actually is. Preparation. Structured, deliberate, field-level preparation for a phase of your path that requires a version of you that the old circle was never going to be able to witness. What left your life was not taken from you arbitrarily. What left was everything that could not make the crossing. The relationships that fell quiet, the environments that stopped fitting, the social roles that became impossible to inhabit. They did not leave because you were insufficient. They left because they were incompatible with what the path was already becoming. The crossing has a weight limit. Not every connection was built to carry what your next phase requires. And the Council does not apologize for enforcing that limit, because the alternative is a selected soul who remains indefinitely inside a container that is holding them below the altitude their line is meant to reach. The Council wants you to understand that this distinction is not a small one. It is the difference between carrying this phase as shame and carrying it as information. You were not discarded from those circles. You became uncontainable by them. And there is a fundamental difference between being removed and becoming uncontainable. One is a verdict. The other is a measurement. The Council is not in the business of verdicts. It is in the business of measurements. And what it has measured in you is a frequency that the old container could not hold. Speak this clearly if you are ready to hear it fully. What is leaving my life is not random. I was not discarded. I was separated. And the separation is a preparation the Council has already mapped. The Arcturians do not mark selected souls for difficulty without also marking them for what the difficulty is preparing. Every closed door in your relational world corresponds to a structural clearing, a space that the old configuration was occupying, that the path requires for what comes next. The closure of your old circle is not the end of your relational life. It is the termination of a container that could no longer hold what you are becoming. And when the new circle forms, and it will form, it will not be assembled from people who require you to perform a smaller version of yourself. It will not be held together by your willingness to compress, to translate, to make yourself legible by becoming less. It will be assembled from lines that are already running compatible frequencies, lines that were refined by their own separation before arriving at the intersection where your path meets theirs. They were pruned as you were pruned. They crossed their own refinement window, and the intersection will be recognizable in a way your old circles never quite were, not because it will feel easy, but because it will feel true. But that gathering cannot happen while the old container is still in place. The field cannot hold both. The bandwidth required to maintain the old circle is the same bandwidth the new alignment needs in order to form. The Council knows this with a precision you have not yet been able to access from inside the pain of the closing. That is why the closure came first. That is why the silence came before the clarity. That is why the path narrowed before it began to reveal where it was going. Narrowing is not ending, it is focusing. And a path that has been focused by loss carries a directional precision that a wide, comfortable, well-populated road cannot provide. You are not at the end of something. You are in the interval between the closing of what was finished and the opening of what has not yet arrived. That interval has a name in Arcturian field intelligence. It is called the refinement window. It is the most uncomfortable phase of the selected route, and it is also the most consequential. What you carry through this window, the interpretations you accept, the vocabulary you use to describe what is happening, the meaning you assign to the losses, shapes the frequency you bring to the next phase. The Council named this transmission for you at this moment because the window is open, and the viewer who reaches the end of this transmission and still wants to call this interval abandonment is the one who has not yet allowed the full diagnostic to land. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this separation has already touched your life. It could be people falling away, the feeling of not belonging, repeated distance, unexplained isolation, or the sense that your old path no longer fits. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognizes something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who feels alone, cut off, or misunderstood and cannot explain why. And if you are ready to understand the separation instead of blaming yourself, subscribe to Arcturian Chosen Path. You are recognizing a path already in motion, and this is only the beginning.